Good evening, and thank you for joining me for another Boring Books for Bedtime. I hope tonight's selection provides all the boredom your busy brain needs to quiet down and let you get some sleep. Before we begin, I'd like to give a special shout out of thanks to some new members of our Patreon family: Lynn, Sharon, Dee Dee, Evan, and Riley. Thank you all so much for supporting this podcast. By becoming members of Patreon, you help us remain 100% listener supported and ad-free for everyone, and it's very much appreciated. And because you became members in the month of August, you and everyone else who supports us through Patreon or with a one-time tip on buymeacoffee.com will be entered into a giveaway at the end of the month, the prizes for which are some exclusive swag found nowhere else. If you're interested in supporting Boring Books for Bedtime and being entered into that giveaway, you'll find links for Patreon and buymeacoffee.com in the show description. Now, let's read and relax. Find a comfortable spot. Adjust your volume. Take a nice deep breath in. Let it out slowly. And off we go. Tonight, let's relax with some more history as we return to Old Country Inns of England by Henry P. Maskell and Edward W. Gregory, with illustrations by the authors. First published in 1911 by L.C. Page & Company, Boston. Let's pick up right where we left off in the middle of Chapter 3 and the history of pilgrimage hospices. Let's begin. In the 14th century, pilgrimages had become the fashion for all classes. With kings and nobles, they were a ceremonial duty. The sick man went to regain his health and discovered it maybe on the breezy heath or sunny downs long before he reached the shrine. The simple, devout soul, no doubt, found in the restful minster the religious consolation he came in search of. More worldly people enjoyed an inexpensive holiday. Merchants went on pilgrimages to avoid their creditors. During their absence, an uncomfortable slump in business could be tided over. Chaucer half conveys a sly suggestion that this was the motive underlying the presence of the merchant in the Canterbury Tales. There wist no wight that he was in debt. Workmen weary of a thankless task found a pretext in a pilgrimage for going off on the quest of a new master. An idle apprentice had an excuse ready at hand for exchanging the dull city workshop for a week in the Kentish orchards. A villein might succeed in reaching some distant town where he could live unbeknown by his lord for the necessary year and a day which meant permanent freedom. Statutes were passed over and over again to restrain these abuses, but they were all evaded. The pilgrimage was an institution hallowed from time immemorial, and none could gainsay the right of every Christian man to take in hand his scrip and staff. Imagine the motley procession almost ceaseless from morn till eve on the Roman roads to the north through St. Albans, eastward to Canterbury, or westward by Reading or Salisbury towards the favored resort. ladies of rank in their horse litters or rich tapestried carriages, peasants in their springless two-wheeled dog carts, then a company of middle-class people on horseback, all of them, men and women alike, well able to manage their steeds. The very poor traveled on foot, and many better class trod barefoot some portion of the Walsingham Green Way as a penitential exercise. Lame, halt, and blind negotiated their journey as best they could. The pilgrim roads were fairly good. Watling Street ran almost straight as an arrow as it was set out by the Roman engineers from Deptford to Canterbury. All roads were said to lead to Walsingham, and that through Ware and Newmarket, if not Roman, were nearly as direct. Pilgrims on horseback from the west of England might utilize the so-called Pilgrim's Way to Canterbury. But by the 14th century, the Kentish portion had been broken up into a series of feeders to the Watling Street. A similar bridle path ran from Newmarket towards Fockenham on the Walsingham route. When night fell, these wayfarers would tax all available resources for their shelter and sustenance. At the manor house they were very unwelcome. The Lord had good cause to detest the idea of poor people going on pilgrimage. The monastery could only receive a small proportion. Many needed nursing as well as rest, and so a special form of lodging house, half inn, half charitable institution, had to be devised. The great hospice at Jerusalem, which provided for fully 1,000 visitors at one time, was regarded as the model, but the idea is much older. At Cebrero in northern Spain, there is a Hospicio Real, founded in 836 by King Alfonso II, for pilgrims crossing the pass of Piedrafita on the way from Segovia to St. James of Compostela. St. John's Hospital at Winchester claims to have been originally founded by St. Brinston about the year 930 for sick and poor pilgrims to St. Swithin. For the Canterbury pilgrims there were many of these hospices. That at Rochester, a private benefaction, we have already mentioned. The George Inn, which still can show a fine early English crypt, may also be described as a pilgrim's inn, though perhaps, like that at St. Albans, for the better class of people. There was a pilgrim's resting house at Bapchild, near Sittingbourne. Ospring, near Faversham, takes its name not from the spring which used to babble so pleasantly along the water lane, but from the great hospice founded by Henry III. By a similar derangement of epitaphs, the hospice at Colnbrook has developed into the Ostrich Inn. A considerable portion of the hospice at Ospring survives to this day in half-timbered buildings around the Crown Inn, and the chapel is said to form the foundation of the Ship Inn on the opposite side of the road. It is more likely that this inn stands on the site of the separate establishment provided for lepers. This hospice must have been of great extent and provided accommodation for rich and poor alike. A master and 3 regular brethren of the Order of the Holy Cross were to superintend the work of hospitality and nursing. Owing to an outbreak of the plague in the reign of Edward IV, the brethren forsook the place in a panic and died without taking care to choose their successors. The property escheated to the Crown, hence the presence of the Crown Inn. Canterbury abounded in hospices of various kinds, some specially reserved for the poorer clergy. The 14th century facade and vaulted lower story of one of these still survives in the High Street. Originally established by St. Thomas himself, it was rebuilt by Archbishop Stratford, whose regulations provided that every pilgrim in health should have one night's lodging to the cost of fourpence, about 5 shillings in modern money. The weak and infirm were to be preferred to the hale, and women upwards of 40 years were to attend to the bedding and administer medicaments to the sick. At Maidstone, there was a large hospice for pilgrims traveling to Canterbury by Malling and Charing. St. Peter's Church was formerly the chapel of this institution. At Reading, the hospice was founded by Abbot Hugh about 1180 and dedicated to St. John the Baptist. A sisterhood of 8 widows ministered to the wants of the pilgrims. We may mention also the hospitals of St. Giles and St. Ethelbert at Hereford, both of very ancient date. At the latter, alms were distributed to 100 poor people daily. Under the sign of the George Inn, we can often detect the successor to a pilgrim's hostel dedicated to St. George of the Dragon. The George at Glastonbury, the very finest existing example of an inn built in stone during the Perpendicular period, was founded by Abbot Selwood in 1489, and provided board and lodging to pilgrims free of charge for 2 days. The George at St. Albans is more suggestive in its present state of a cozy, well-ordered coaching inn of the Georgian period, with nothing visible of antiquity except its paneled staircase and beautiful old furniture. But its records carry us back to 1401, and in 1448 it received a license from the abbot for the celebration of Low Mass in the private chapel on account of the many noble and worthy personages who resorted thither when on pilgrimage to the cathedral. At another George and Dragon hospice at Wymondham, the saint has succumbed to the reptile, and the green dragon presides alone on the signboard. Pilgrims to shrines beyond sea were not forgotten. At Dover, the Maison Dieu was built and endowed by Hubert de Burgh, the great justiciary, in the reign of Edward III, and on crossing to Calais, the adventurer found another Maison Dieu, the first of a long chain of resting places on the way to Rome. The Three Kings at Cologne, or Rocamadour in Guyenne, according as his fancy or devotion might direct him. Chapter 4. The Rise of the Towns. Every high road leads sooner or later to a market town, and in that town the tourist might be sure of finding a White Hart Inn. The White Hart is the commonest of signs all through England. Half-timbered and rambling, with the marks of decrepit old age and long service writ large all over it, this inn is in evidence near the market-place, often in a street of the same name, to remind us of its importance in the days gone by. Sometimes, as at Guildford or Brentwood, the old building lies hidden behind a more modern front. When the builder has laid violent hands on a White Hart, title deeds or other authentic records of its antiquity are in nearly every case available. A vague tradition attempts to explain these inns as royal posting houses, it being supposed that stations to supply fresh horses for the royal journeys were first established during the last years of Edward III. Undoubtedly, the White Hart Inns all date from the beginning of the reign of Richard II. After the scandals and misrule during the long dotage of his father, the nation centered all their hopes in the young king, who showed promise of becoming a wise and able ruler. The policy of the good Parliament would once more govern in the council, and it seemed a happy omen when he took for his badge the white stag with a collar of gold around his neck. This legend, portrayed on so many signboards, was a delight of the medieval romantic writers. The White Hart was never to be taken alive except by one who had conquered the whole world. Its oldest form appears in the pages of Aristotle, who relates how Diomedes consecrated a white stag to Diana and how it lived for 1,000 years before it was killed by Agathocles, king of Sicily. Pliny gives Alexander the Great, and later writers Julius Caesar and Charlemagne, as the emperors who captured the young white stag and released it after decorating it with the golden band. On the Dorchester Road, near Stowminster, there used to be an inn with this kingly stag painted for a sign, and underneath the following lines, translated from a medieval quatrain by some not very conscientious scholar, who has imported Caesar, stag and all, into the west of England. When Julius Caesar landed here, I was then a little deer. When Julius Caesar reigned king, round my neck he put this ring. Whoever shall me overtake, spare my life for Caesar's sake. But when we begin to inquire into the actual title deeds of the White Hart Inns, we find ourselves in the midst of movements of far deeper import than the outburst of national loyalty on the signboards. The story of a great medieval fiscal policy, the birth of home manufactures, the struggle of the towns for municipal rights. The sign of the White Hart marks a turning point in the great social and industrial revolution which was to bring to the great body of Englishmen prosperity and freedom. No country could compare with England during the Middle Ages for the production of wool. From the 12th century onwards, wool was almost the only export and the principal source of wealth for landowners and farmers. So important a trade was bound to receive the attention of chancellors in search of a new tax. Accordingly, early in the 13th century, a system was devised by which no wool could possibly be exported until it had contributed its quota to the royal treasury. Wool, as well as some other raw materials such as skins, lead, and tin, had to be brought for sale to an appointed place called the staple, where the trade was under the superintendence of a special corporation, whose seal must appear on every bale. The staple was at first fixed at Bruges, the chief seaport of the Flemish cloth manufacturers. But during the reign of Edward III, it was moved to England, and then finally in 1390 established at Calais. Thither every dealer was obliged to carry his bales by certain approved routes, through Boston, London, Sandwich, Winchester, or Southampton. And these towns became subsidiary centers of the staple. Staple Inn in Holborn was an inn for merchants of the staple before it became a resort for the lawyers. In the end, the merchants of the staple grew into a ring of powerful monopolists who controlled prices, regulated times of sale, and even secured the carrying trade in their own hands. The sale of English sheep abroad, either for breeding or for shearing, was also forbidden under very heavy penalties. All these vexatious formalities in getting his wool to Calais and the rapacity of the merchants of the staple disgusted the English farmer. As early as 1258, Simon de Montfort urged that England ought to be a center of manufacture and not merely a source of raw material. Edward III, while with one hand consolidating the power of the monopolists who controlled the staple, on the other hand stimulated the obvious remedy. He invited Flemish weavers to settle in this country. By the end of his reign, the whirring sound of the looms might be heard all through Norfolk, Essex, and Kent. From a country of farmers which exported wool, England was soon to be transformed into a country of manufacturers who exported cloth. The sale of wool at the staple dwindled away, while Yorkshire tweeds and Cotswold broadcloth were winning the preference for price and quality in the most distant markets. The commercial prosperity of England is generally said to have been built up on the industries arising out of the wool pack, but in the 14th century, capital was already being found for the development of many other enterprises. In 1307, there were complaints about London fog owing to the use of coal as fuel. In the Sussex Weald and the Forest of Dean, the iron trade was so busy that it was necessary to import a considerable portion of the ore from Sweden and Spain. The excellence of English guns, it is said, contributed largely to the victories of Henry V in France. The lost art of brick-making was reintroduced by the Flemings. Cheaper labor and materials induced copper founders from Dinan and bell founders from Liège to transfer their trades hither. Instead of bringing beer from Prussia, the shipmasters found it more profitable to export Maidstone ales into Flanders. Meanwhile, the towns from a position of semi-servitude had been step by step attaining to liberty, wealth, and the political franchise. London led the way, owing to the presence of merchants from Rouen and Caen, who settled there immediately after the conquest and took the position of a governing class prepared to treat with the king for privileges. The steps by which the various boroughs secured their rights of self-government, free speech and free meeting, and equal justice would need several volumes to describe. They were won by steady, solid perseverance, by customs allowed to grow up unnoticed during the quarrels between the barons and the royal favorites, by a direct bargain with the lord of the manor, or in a few instances, by less ingenious methods. Most of the towns, like London, were situated on the royal domain. With these, the work was comparatively easy. Secure of his ultimate supremacy, and indifferent to small sources of power, the king was generally willing to surrender local claims for a fixed payment in money. A corporation was a better security for the payment of dues than petty officers given to peculation. Accordingly, from the reign of Henry I, charters were granted giving a progressive degree of liberty, although until the reign of John the King retained the nomination of the portreeve or mayor. The feudal baron was not so willing to part with his supremacy, but the nobility were rapidly becoming poorer, and the issue of the battle was ultimately with the strong. Either the powerful merchants' guild, returning unwearied to the fray after each rebuff, by its steady, dogged agitation ended in forcing a compromise, or else the traders deserted the place and let it dwindle away into a poverty-stricken village. Sometimes an ancient charter was alleged to exist, and prescriptive rights claimed before a commission in the king's courts, and the longest purse could fee the most persistent counsel. Much less hopeful were the prospects of citizens whose lord was a religious house. The monasteries were rich, well acquainted with forms of law, and as trustees, not justified in parting with their hereditary assets. Hitherto promoters of progress, the monks now began to be regarded as a stumbling block on the path towards freedom, and from this arose the smoldering hatred of the monasteries that underlies so much of the literature of the 14th and 15th centuries. During the Great Revolt of the Vallaines, the monasteries and bishops' palaces on the route of the insurgents were all burnt and sacked by the mob. At St. Albans, Cirencester, and even in the Cinque Port of Romney, the struggles of the townsfolk to burst their thraldom were endless and always futile. It was organized force in conflict with organized authority, and the result was that the latter prevailed. The Merchant Guild became the Guild of the Holy Trinity, and shared with the Corpus Christi Guild, of which the prior and other churchmen were members, all authority in the town, nominating the mayor and all the important officials. Simon de Montfort, the father of English liberty, was the first to recognize the growing importance of the commercial middle classes by summoning 2 burgesses from each of the town boroughs to his parliament in 1264, and their presence was treated as a matter of course in subsequent parliaments, though they formed a comparatively insignificant factor. In the reign of Edward III, when the Knights of the Shire associated with them to form the future House of Commons, their growing wealth and ability to make terms with the king as a condition of granting supplies was recognized, and a marked increase of parliamentary activity commenced. Their petitions became, on the assent of the crown, statutes of the realm, and henceforward the lower house was to initiate nearly all legislation. And now we can return to our White Hart Inns. They were the first inns to be built by the corporations, or at least under their license. Secure in the possession of their charter, proud of their ever-increasing commerce, hopeful of the future privileges and reforms that were likely to be obtained by their burgesses in Parliament, the towns began to provide new inns of a superior kind for the merchants who came regularly to their markets. They were held direct from the king, and to the reigning king alone they looked for any future marks of favor. Hence these inns almost invariably bear the badge of the reigning king. When Richard II was deposed, the White Hart gave place to the White Swan of Henry IV, and this latter is nearly as common on the signboards. Barons and earls might dispute and make war on one another as to who was the sovereign de jure. The concern of the towns was with the king de facto. The commons regarded each change of dynasty from Plantagenet to Red Rose, and from Red Rose to White Rose, with the complacency of the Vicar of Bray. The old aristocracy ruined themselves and died out amid these political disputes. Meanwhile, the burghers grew rich, and their posterity formed the nucleus of a new aristocracy of English race and of more patriotic instincts. The signboards tell the same tale all through the 15th century. The antelope of Henry VI, the white lion of Edward IV, and the white boar of Richard III each take their turn. The changes they represented meant little more than incidental gossip to the burghers. All the real life of the citizens was in their home and trade, in their craft guilds, in treaties with neighboring towns, or in the little controversies of the town council. We know only a few incidental details about the internal comforts of the White Hart inns. The majority of the guests slept in large rooms on couches or wooden bedsteads. Only a few very important grandees were accorded a private camera. The bed was a long, sack-like mattress stuffed with straw or hay. Great folk would carry with them their own bed on their journeys. Most people lay in their ordinary clothes on the bed, though counterpanes and linen were just coming into use. Carpets were chiefly employed like tapestry for hanging on the walls and diminishing the continual draughts. The women had their special apartments. The serving men slept on the rushes of the hall, while the grooms were left to make the best of stable and barn. Meals were taken at fixed hours, at a long movable table on trestles in the hall, guests and servants sitting down together, but placed according to rank. Some of the dishes would not commend themselves to fastidious moderns, but at least there was never any lack of good wholesome fare. Loaves, joints, and meat pasties, all on a gargantuan scale. Wines of British as well as foreign extraction competed with the nut-brown ale. Essex was in those days the vineyard of England. How much we have fallen off in the capacity of our stomachs from the good old times of open-air life and daily exercise on horseback may be judged from the following allowance of provisions granted to Lady Lucy, one of the maids of honor to Queen Catherine of Aragon. Breakfast: a chine of beef, a loaf, a gallon of ale. Luncheon: bread and a gallon of ale. Dinner: a piece of boiled beef, a slice of roast meat, a gallon of ale. Supper: porridge, mutton, a loaf, and a gallon of ale. When the warden of Merton College travelled with 2 of his fellows and 4 servants from Oxford to Durham in 1331, the season being winter, their average bill was 2d for beds for the whole party, or for the servants alone, 1 halfpenny. At the town inns of 50 years later, the price of a bed was 1 penny, and the increased comfort warranted the higher charge. The private rooms, instead of being numbered, received names according to the subject portrayed on the tapestry hangings. This custom continued in old-fashioned inns up to quite recent times, and has served as the basis of stage humor of a sort. Scene: a country inn. Timothy: what rooms have you disengaged, waiter? Waiter: why, sir, there's the Moon, but I forget, there's a man in that. Timothy: eh, a man in the Moon? Oh, then, we'll not go there. Waiter: there's the Waterloo subscription, sir, that's full. There's the Pope's Head, that's empty, etc., etc. In the minute books of the Grey Coat Hospital, a very valuable religious educational charity, we come across a rather startling entry. On Epiphany 1698, after prayers and sermon in church, the children and their parents dined in hell. Heaven and hell were two public dining rooms adjoining the old Palace of Westminster, and so named either from their hangings or other pictorial decoration. Chapter 5: The Craft Guilds and Traders' Inns. Of the writing of books about the medieval guilds there seems to be no end, and each new contribution serves to mystify rather than to throw light on the difficulties of the subject. From the earliest times, it was an inherent tendency of the Teutonic races to combine and form guilds. There were guilds for the building of bridges, for the relief of poor pilgrims, and for almost every imaginable purpose, ranging from the organization of a municipality to the Saxon Frith Guild, which undertook the punishment of thieves and the exacting of compensation for homicides. As to the craft guilds of the Middle Ages, some are content to regard them as trade unions, others as similar to our modern clubs, and a third class of writers assert that they were purely religious. As a matter of fact, they were capable of becoming all three in turn. No doubt the original motive of these guilds was to create a monopoly and artificial control over the particular trade, and also to obtain that security which only an organized association is able to give against tyranny and corruption. They comprised all ranks: wage earners, manufacturers, and merchants. The weakness of such a body was that there was no community of interests as regards the internal economy of the industry. That is to say, the merchants and masters would not be induced to improve the position of their apprentices or to raise the wages of journeymen. The only common ground would lie in attempts to assert the interests of the trade at large against the whole body of consumers or against competing trades. On the other hand, the corporation itself was originally a guild which had succeeded in obtaining a charter and thus becoming the administrative authority. It would regard with anxiety the creation of other bodies which might follow in its footsteps and become very dangerous rivals. Charters, indeed, were in the 12th century being bought from the king, which rendered fraternities dependent for their existence on the royal will alone. The weavers of London lived in a quarter by themselves, with their own courts, and raised their own taxes, suffering no intrusion from the city officials. Only by an expensive process of boycotting was this abuse brought to an end. When once the municipalities perceived their danger, they proceeded ruthlessly to reduce the craft guilds into subjection, and to limit the purposes for which they were permitted to combine. And this brings us to the second period in the history of the craft guilds, when we find each trade forming itself into an association to provide a burial fund for its deceased members, masses for the repose of their souls, and to organize a solemn procession and miracle play on the annual festival. Behind the religious association, the union for trade purposes remained. When the secular powers of the craft guild were more clearly defined in the 15th century under the style of a company, the observance of the mystery was often allowed to fall into desuetude. The companies became mere trustees of the endowments belonging to the religious guilds, and treated with equanimity the abolition of these trusts at the Reformation. In the third period, the craft guilds as companies became a useful adjunct of the corporation, protecting the community from overcharges, settling disputes in the trade, and generally forming courts of reference on technical matters. The city companies of today, though not under any compulsion to do so, still occasionally render service of a kindred nature. The work of the Plumbers' Company a few years ago, in arranging for the examination and registration of plumbers, will be called to mind. The Apothecaries' Company has also done good service. Out of the guilds of the Holy Trinity at Hull and at Deptford has grown the Corporation of Trinity House, that wealthy philanthropic body that builds lighthouses, licenses pilots, and ministers in various ways to the welfare of our merchant shipping. At Headquarn and Cranbrook in the Weald of Kent, and again at Lavenham and Sudbury in Suffolk, may be seen many beautiful examples of the halls of the craft guilds, now derelict and converted to less noble purposes. Part of the King's Head at Aylesbury is supposed by experts to have been anciently a guild hall. We shall refer more fully to this building in another chapter. We have seen that the guilds afforded very few advantages to the wage earners, and according to the natural tendency of all such bodies, they ended in becoming aristocratic and exclusive. They were for a long period masters of the labor of the country, preventing any attempts at strikes, and securing that all disputes as to the rate of pay should be settled by the arbitration of their own warden. Vainly the serving men of the saddlers strove to form a guild of their own. On the harmless pattern of a religious body, with their own festival at Our Lady of Stratford-le-Bow, it was complained of them that in 13 years their hire had more than doubled the ordinary rate, and their meetings were ruthlessly repressed. The May Day festival of the journeymen shearers in Shrewsbury was suppressed for a similar reason. Only one refuge remained for the oppressed workman, the inn, which for centuries was to be the place where he could hold these more or less illegal meetings with his comrades. In the houses of call for artisans, the workers discussed their grievances, hatched conspiracies and strikes, or devised less drastic methods for the betterment of their condition. At Kidderminster there is an inn called the Holy Blaze, after the patron of weavers. Another, Bishop Blaze, exists in the heart of the city of London, in New Inn Yard. The Boar's Head, by the way, was a commonly accepted emblem of St. Blaise. Many St. Crispins or Jolly Crispins survive to represent the shoemaker. St. Hugh was another patron of the shoe trade, and there was once a St. Hugh's Bones in Clare Market. Simon the Tanner is an old house in Long Lane, Bermondsey. A later age absurdly renamed inns frequented by the laboring class as the Weaver's Arms, Carpenter's Arms, Bricklayer's Arms, etc., etc. These inns, a common occurrence in every large town, are often of old foundation, and incidentally commemorate the fact that in the public house it was that the wage earners first learnt the art of combination for their own betterment. Here the earliest trade unions found a welcome and a home, with which many of their successors are still content. The club room at the inn was the cradle of the friendly societies. The Freemasons have given name to a whole series of taverns. All the numerous and generally well-managed benefit societies on the pattern of the Foresters, Hearts of Oak, and Odd Fellows owe their very existence to the public house. It was anciently the custom for workmen to be paid at the nearest inn, and out of this, during the bad period at the beginning of the 19th century, grew a very serious abuse. Those to whom was entrusted the duty of engaging and paying various forms of precarious and unskilled labor, such as coal whippers and porters, found it profitable to become owners of public houses, where the unfortunate men were kept waiting for a job which was generally awarded to the individual whose score was the largest. When the men returned from their work, they were expected to spend a considerable portion of their earnings for the good of the house. The Truck Act of 1843 put an end to this heartless scandal. The woolpack and fleece were of course the signs of inns frequented by the merchants who came to buy wool. At Guildford, all the alehouses were at one time required to exhibit a woolpack as a token of the leading commodity in the town. There is a very fine old Golden Fleece Inn at South Weald in Essex, broad-fronted and roomy, Jacobean in style, but fallen sadly from its old estate since the coach traffic ceased on the Ipswich road. The Three Kings was anciently the sign of the mercers, because in the Middle Ages linen thread materials brought from Cologne had the highest reputation, and were probably stamped either with the figures of the three wise men or with 3 crowns. But the 3 crowns are asserted to be more commonly emblematic of the 3 kingdoms of England, Scotland, and Ireland. The golden ball was another mercer's sign, from the arms of Constantinople, which was formerly the center of the silk trade. The Elephant and Castle was the crest of the Cutler's Company. However, the Elephant and Castle at the corner of Newington Causeway has a quite different origin. The skeleton of an elephant was discovered while digging a gravel pit near this spot in 1714. Elephants in medieval heraldry were invariably represented as carrying a solidly built castle, a traveler's exaggeration of the Indian palanquin. The lion and castle indicated a dealer in Spanish wines, because sherry casks were stamped with the brand of the Spanish arms. Foresters resorted for company to the Green Man, and the survival of many old taverns of that name reminds us that there were numerous forests in the neighborhood of London. The Northwood, or Norwood, extended from near the Green Man at Dulwich to Croydon, where there is another Green Man Inn. The Green Man at Leytonstone stands on the verge of Epping Forest. Wherever a painted sign exists on one of these houses, it generally represents either an archer or a forester clad in Lincoln green. The Two Brewers does not denote that the ale of the 2 rival tradesmen is on sale, but the manner in which beer was anciently carried about before the invention of brewers' drays. 2 porters are shown bearing the precious barrel slung between them on a pole. Last of all to be mentioned among the inns which remind us of disappearing occupations are those found usually where the ancient green ways join the main roads to London. The drover and his herd of tired, wild-eyed cattle is no longer a feature on the roadside. It is cheaper and more convenient to send oxen to market by cattle train. but the long green lanes, touching here and there a market town, extend through the eastern and midland counties right up to the north of England. Lonely and deserted, practicable only by the pedestrian or the rider of a sure-footed pony, scarcely ever used except by the county officials, whose duty it is to maintain the right of way, they remain as an ideal hunting ground for the naturalist. When the explorer, tired and hungry after many miles of rough journeying, finds shelter at the drover's call, butcher's arms, or jolly drovers, the purpose of these old, half-forgotten byroads is made clear to him, and he can meditate during his hour of rest on the changes which 50 years have made in the methods of transport. And with that, we reach the end of Chapter 5, which seems as good a place as any to end this evening's reading from Old Country Inns of England. I'm really enjoying this history, I must say, and finding out the meaning behind some of those inn names, so often seen in British books and television, is surprisingly interesting. I hope you enjoyed that. If you'd like to read this work for yourself and see the many illustrations and photographs, as always, you'll find a link to a free ebook from Project Gutenberg in the show description. If you'd like to connect, suggest a boring book you'd like to hear read, or request more from one we've already started, you can drop me an email via our website, www.boringbookspod.com. It's always a pleasure to hear from you. Thank you so much for joining me for this evening's reading. Until our next boring book, good night.